So for chapter 10, we are going to break it down into three different lectures. We're going to do kind of general senses, then we're going to go to, so first will be general senses, then I believe we do eye or vision, ear, hearing, and balance equilibrium. So let's start with general senses. First, let's kind of review the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. The afferent branch of the peripheral nervous system, that starts at a receptor in periphery. So you start with the receptor. That receptor has an axon. It's going to synapse on a second neuron in the central nervous system. Then it's going to go up to most likely the thalamus, where it synapses on a third neuron that goes to its cortex. Now, in general sensory, that cortex is the somatosensory cortex, which is your postcentral gyrus. If it's coming from the retina of the eye, it could be your visual cortex. Cochlea can be your auditory cortex. So the cortex depends on where this receptor and what type of receptor. It's important to define perception. Perception is a conscious interpretation of the sensory messages coming in or sensory action potentials coming in and then being associated with neural networks already formed. And so you can have a conscious interpretation. So perception is not sensation. A sensation is the receptor generates an action potential. That is a sensation. Now, everyone has the same sensation. We all generate the same action potentials. But the way we consciously interpret it or our perception is going to be different because we have different neural networks that have formed from the moment we were born. And so we have information coming in all the time from the external environment, from the internal environment, from receptors of all types, sending action potentials into the central nervous system. Now, sensory systems, again, are somatosensory. These are your general sensory systems. Somatic, meaning it's coming from the skin. It can be pain, temperature, pressure, pain, or it could be proprioception, in which case it's coming from muscle fibers. They have receptors, joints, tendons, Golgi tendon apparatus. They all have receptors. And so these receptors, either coming from the skin or the proprioceptors, are going to all send the action potentials ultimately to the somatosensory system. That's the somatosensory cortex. Special senses are special, right? Vision is coming from the retina and it's going to end in the visual cortex. Hearing, right? Cochlea, it's going to end at the auditory cortex. Balance and equilibrium, it's going to the temporal lobe as well. Taste and smell, temporal insular lobe. So they all have their own cortex. and they're special. They get their own special. So two types of receptors, somatosensory are an all-in-one unit. These are your general sensory receptors. What does that mean? It means that the receptor is part of the sensory afferent first order neuron. I like to say it's an all-in-one unit. Receptor neuron combo. That's general sensory receptors. Special sensory receptors have many cells that make up the receptor. And it can be different from the first order afferent neuron. So it is not an all-in-one unit. Special senses, multiple cells, complicated. Somatosensory, all-in-one unit, less complicated. So sensory receptor definition is a specialized cell or cells that monitor the conditions inside the body, conditions outside the body. Stimulation of a receptor is going to directly or indirectly, if it's special, it's going to generate an action potential in the first order sensory afferent neuron. Now, that's a sensation. That's where action potentials arrives at the central nervous system. Again, everyone has the same sensation. But perception is that conscious awareness, and this is different for everyone. Why? We have set up different neural networks and have different associations and memories. And so stimulus are meant to just be perceived differently. So to kind of talk about the fallibility of perception, eyewitnesses aren't the greatest. Because if I were to say, hey, what do you guys see right now? What you looking at? Most of you people right now are looking at it and going, yeah, there's a square, right? And you're thinking, oh, a square. But is it a square? No, this is just a blank space. What we're really seeing are four green Pac-Man. Or Pac-Women, or Pac-Them. Why? Why do we see square? Because we see squares most often. And so our perception is there's a square there, but there really isn't a square there. It's just truly a blank space in the shape of a square. All right, next one. When you look at this, are the lines of the square perfectly straight? And most people, the perception is, no, they're not. It looks like they are bending. But truly, if we were to get out a ruler and draw a straight line with that ruler, you can see that they are perfectly straight. The vision of it, the way we are perceiving it, is those sides look bent. All right, this next one, without peeking, I want you to say out loud the first thing that you see. Okay, you have to say it out loud. Now, some of you guys are going to look at it and say it's a duck. But then other people are going to look at it and say it's a rabbit or a bunny. Why? Because some people see more bunnies and they like bunnies, and so they perceive it as a bunny. Other people might have ducks all over the place around their house, and they see ducks all the time, and they're going to perceive it as a duck. That's the memory part. That is our perception. That is where you're seeing visually this object and you are associating it with some memories, and you're forming a perception about what you're seeing. And so perception is fallible. What we perceive to be the truth may or may not be the truth, because all of our brains have been wired differently. Receptor physiology is such that these sensory receptors are going to detect a specific type of energy. And so each receptor has its own specific type of energy that it is going to respond to. And so that is called the characteristic sensitivity or the receptor specificity. Specificity basically means that photoreceptors in the retina of the eye are only responding to photons in the light waves. Chemoreceptors are only responding to some kind of chemical in solution. So it could be taste or smell, but it can also be burning or some kind of pain response. Thermoreceptors are responding to temperatures, right? So warm thermoreceptors respond to degrees over 30 degrees Celsius, up to 43. I should have it in Fahrenheit because I don't really know my Celsius all that well. And cold is the opposite. Mechanoreceptors are touch, can be pain, can be pressure, can be proprioception. So responding to balance, in the ear, sound waves for hearing, those are mechanoreceptors. Balance and equilibrium as well. It can be acceleration, moving fluids. So mechanoreceptors are responding to something moving the receptor or pushing on the receptor. And when these energy modalities excite the receptor, it's called sensory transduction. So when a receptor converts a specific form of energy, the stimulus, into an electric energy, i.e. an action potential, it's transducing the stimulus energy into an action potential voltage energy in your neuron. Receptor or generated potentials, these are your graded potentials, right? Your excitatory, postsynaptic potentials, I guess can be inhibitory. And so they are basically opening and closing ion channels. These opening and closing of ion channels are going to be triggered by the specific stimulus. So each receptor is only responding to a specific energy modality to make that graded potential happen. If the receptor potential sums to exceed threshold, then you have an action potential. That is to say, some little amount of stimulus energy doesn't necessarily generate an action potential in the first order sensory neuron. That is so there's some threshold for you to kind of not have every single energy cause an action potential. So first thing is you have the stimulus on the receptor. So stimulus is applied to receptor, which is the same as the afferent neuron. We also call it first order sensory neuron. And if the stimulus is enough to depolarize to negative 55 millivolts, then it's going to exceed threshold and we have an action potential generated. Now the action potential is going to be propagated in the central nervous system at some point, synapsing on a second order sensory neuron in the central nervous system. Can be excitatory or inhibitory. Sensory receptor, this is more common in special senses. You can have a stimulus. So this is kind of what happens in the retina. right? The photoreceptors have light waves. And those light waves can stimulate the cones and rods to actually inhibit neurotransmitter to be released. And when there's no neurotransmitter, it actually generates a graded potential in the bipolar cells. So this is an example of an inhibitory system. So some of them are excitatory, some can be inhibitory. It's really specific when you get to those special senses. A couple of other things I want to mention about receptors. These are general receptors. There's something called receptor adaptation. And the definition of that is a decrease in the amplitude of the receptor potential, meaning it decreases the graded potential on postsynaptic. And what does that mean? It means decreases neurotransmitter released onto it. Postsynaptic neuron. And so less neurotransmitters released, and it's going to have less action potentials generated. And so you have a decrease in the perception. You just don't even notice that that stimulus is happening anymore because it just doesn't reach the level of the cortex. That's sensory adaptation. That is where the sensory receptor just slowly stops responding. And we call that synaptic fatigue. This is good for things like background sounds, white noise, right? Background sounds, white noise, or basically a hat on our head. At first, you quote unquote feel that something's there because your hair got moved and you have free nerve endings attached to the hair roots, and you can feel that, i.e., you perceive it to have happened, right? But if the hat's there long enough, you have sensory synaptic fatigue or sensory adaptation. You stop being consciously aware of it. You don't have the perception that the hat's there or that the sound's there. If I tell you that the sound's still there, the hat's there, you can quote unquote perceive it again because you're drawing your attention there. And so that is sensory adaptation. That's a little bit different from central adaptation. That is a complete inhibition of the entire sensory pathway. We see this with smell. You smell something right at first because those chemicals dissolve in your mucus and activate your olfactory receptors for smell. But if those same chemicals are there over and over and over again, it just basically stops the first order neuron from generating an action potential, which inhibits the second order and third order, and you don't smell it anymore. That is why you can leave your house for a week or two. Right when you come back into your house, you quote unquote smell it. But if you're in your house for a little bit of time, you stop smelling it. We don't smell our stinky dogs. And you're saying, oh, my dog doesn't stink. Well, it might. We just don't smell it anymore. I mean, I got cats. My house probably smells like cat. I don't smell it. Other people probably smell it. That is central adaptation. So sensory adaptation, decrease over time in the magnitude of the receptor potential. And so basically it decreases the frequency of action potentials being generated, and therefore it's going to decrease the perception of the stimulus. Receptors are going to monitor a specific field. So we're going to do something called 2-point discrimination. We're going to have some fun with sensory receptor fields. A sensory unit is the receptor and the amount or area it monitors, right? So the area monitored by a single receptor, the receptor field is the area it is monitoring, and a sensory unit is that receptor and the receptor field. I keep talking about first order, second order, third order neuron. There are 3 neurons in a sensory pathway. The first order neuron is the afferent sensory neuron. It is from the receptor into the central nervous system. Brain or spinal cord is your central nervous system. It is then going to synapse on a second neuron. That is the second order neuron. It's from first order neuron to the thalamus, except for smell. Smell is the only sensory pathway that doesn't synapse in the thalamus, but every other sensory pathway, whether it's somatosensory, general, or special senses, then it's going to synapse in the thalamus on a third order neuron that goes to its specific cortex. So this sensory pathway is happening for all different sensory, whether it's general, somatosensory, or special. This is going down. So first order neuron, you can go through this afferent, and it goes through to second order, to the thalamus, and then thalamus to the cortex. The concept of receptor fields applies to all first, second, and third order neurons. And this is important when you have integration or lateral inhibition of certain pathways, because, or even perceived pain. This can happen in this area because you can have multiple first order neurons synapsing on the same second order neuron. And so we call this, we have something called sensory coding. It's coding for the stimulus type, and which pathway it's actually activating. So coding is the conversion of a stimulus into a signal that's conveyed to the central nervous system. By the way, perceptions are never based on a single sensory pathway, but it's the integration from the different sensory systems associating in the association areas of your brain that are giving you perceptions, which is how you're viewing that stimulus, how you see that stimulus. It's why some people can love something and other people can really not love it, right? Sensory coding is coding for the intensity. How strong is stimulus, right? And that is due to the frequency of the action potentials that are generated. Receptor. And then the second thing is the number of receptors activated or are generating action potentials. So our brain understands intensity of a specific stimulus by how many action potentials are being generated by a receptor, and then how many receptors in that same area are generating action potentials. And so we can have first order neurons right next to each other, say on your skin. If you have a tiny little cut, it's just going to activate maybe one sensory receptor, a nociceptor for pain. If you have a bigger cut, it's activating several nociceptors along that whole area. And so you're getting more frequency of action potentials, and you're getting them from multiple receptors. So you know that that cut is bigger and or deeper. You perceive it as more intense. So the size of the receptor field is what gives you an idea about localizing where that receptor is coming from. And so if you have a receptor field that is really large, it means one receptor is monitoring a big area. And it's hard to really localize where that sensation is coming from. The smaller the receptor field, the more you can really precisely locate where that sensation is coming from. And so that's the acuity. The acuity is the precision in which you can perceive exactly where the stimulus is coming from. And so the size and the number of receptor fields are going to enable you to locate where that sensation is coming from. And then how much overlap between these receptor fields is there, right? So more overlap means more neurons are going to be depolarized. And then there's something called lateral inhibition. And that's where a strong stimulus that excites receptors in a given location can actually send inhibitory signals to the receptors nearby. So you can really accurately locate because you're inhibiting the pathways that are near that stimulus. So that's lateral inhibition. So sensory coding, again, based on the receptor fields, the size, how much overlap between those receptor fields, and if there's any lateral inhibition going on. So localization is going to improve like our kind of perception of that stimulus and where exactly it's coming from. And so this is kind of showing you sensory coding. So these are all afferent first order neurons. These are all second order neurons. And as you can see, X1 can make connections to Y1, and Z1 can make connections to Y1, and Y1 can make connections to Z1 and X1. And so this is where lateral inhibition can occur, because if you want to make sure that this pathway is generating action potentials, you're going to inhibit this pathway and inhibit this pathway. And so you're really perceiving the action potentials from Y and basically limiting neurotransmitter being released from X and Z. And so that's what this is all about, right? So you're increasing the frequency of action potentials here on Y by inhibiting the release of neurotransmitters in these two pathways in the second order neuron. So this is going on in the second order neuron. Lateral inhibition is going to increase acuity and increase the contrast of signals because it's drowning out weaker signals and kind of amplifying the stronger sensory. So we're going to do 2-point discrimination in lab. I'm not going to get too into the weeds into it right now in lecture because we're going to go through this in lab, but this is giving you basically the size of the receptor field. So the smaller the distance between receptor fields means you're going to have higher acuity. You're going to be able to really locate or perceive where that sensation is coming in. So we'll cover that in lab. And that is stimulus location, right? We want our brain to be able to kind of code or understand the quality, like how much, and how strong that sensation is or that stimulus is, and how intense it is. And that will form our actions, right? If we step on a nail and it's going all the way up and through our foot, we want to know that it's really intense and we're going to lift up our foot. That's different than if there's a little pebble in your shoe, right? You don't need to freak out and lift your foot up. So that's what sensory coding is for. And this works for all receptors except smell and sound. Smell and sound does not really have receptor fields. And so it works a little bit different, and it's a little different in localizing like where is the sound coming from and where is that smell coming from, and we kind of have to move our head in order to localize that. So that these are the two sensations that don't really do the whole, receptor field, receptor unit. All right, last thing we're going to go through right now is the general senses or the somatosensory system. These are your general senses. They are proprioceptors, that is body position, joint angle, muscle tension, basically where's your body in space. Mechanoreceptors, again, can be touch. It's some kind of physical distortion. Activates these receptors. Some kind of physical distortion. Thermoreceptor, it's going to be activated by temperature. Nociceptors are really kind of interesting. They could be free nerve endings associated with hair roots or just on their own. And really, they could be superficial in the skin to a little bit deeper, and they are responding to either chemical type of burning things, or cutting them, or hot and cold stimulus. We are also going to be doing this in lab. So we have this sensory lab that we're really looking at all these different receptors. Super fun. So exoreceptors are outside, proprioceptors monitor body position, interoceptors for the inside of our body. And then I want you to know nociceptors are for pain, really tissue damage. Thermoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, and chemoreceptors. So kind of review this. This is actually a slide from anatomy. Somatosensory receptors in skin are mechanoreceptors. They're responding to physical distortion. This is giving you the rapidly adapting, meaning you get used to this real quick. So this is like a massage. If someone's really giving you like pressure in the same area, that receptor is just going to adapt and you're going to have sensory adaptation. It doesn't quote feel as good anymore. We're slow adapting. We never quite adapt to our free nerve endings for pain going away, or burning receptors. Those kind of keep letting you know they're happening. You can read through the receptors. And this just goes through the temperatures and what temperatures activate the cold receptors and what temperatures activate. And then the frequency of action potentials. So obviously, the higher the temperature, the more frequent the action potentials. And that's how you perceive it's hot, right? As opposed to just kind of warm is frequency of action potentials. That's generated. So this is just response to temperature in terms of frequency of action potentials and what temperature is reading on the skin. Somatosensory cortex, one column, one modality. There are different pathways. So this is one pathway. We're not going through all the different pathways, but I am going to mention the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. This is your somatosensory pathway for touch, pressure, and proprioception, which is body position. A couple of things. One, this is your first order sensory afferent neuron. It's from the receptor into the spinal cord, where it's going to synapse on a second order neuron in the spinal cord. On that second order neuron, it actually crosses over to the opposite side of the spinal cord and then goes to the opposite thalamus and the opposite primary somatosensory cortex of the brain. That is to say, if you stimulate a left side receptor, you are going to receive action potential in the right side or hemisphere of brain, in that primary somatosensory cortex, called desiccation. So if something happens to our left side, we are going to perceive it or receive it in our right primary somatosensory cortex, which is our postcentral gyrus, and vice versa. So spinal thalamic deals with pain and temperature. Same thing's going on though. Receptor first order, synapses in the spinal cord, desiccates or crosses over in that second order neuron, thalamus on the opposite side, and opposite primary somatosensory cortex. Pain perception is really interesting because stimulus of a nociceptor or pain receptor is going to be diffuse and it's going to synapse on a second order neuron, but also it's going to synapse on other neurons. And so the activation of a nociceptor, you're going to perceive where that pain is coming from. That's the sensory pathway, but it's also synapsing on autonomic centers to increase blood pressure, increase heart rate, increase the release of norepinephrine, increase blood glucose, increase pupillary dilation, increase sweating, right? So it's going to synapse on multiple neurons And that's causing autonomic responses. It's causing limbic system responses. And this is where we have different reactions to painful stimulus. Some people cannot tolerate painful stimulus. It's just the way it's perceived in their brain is too much. Where that same amount of stimulation, other people can just block it down. And so pain is one of those things that is a perception. You have two different types of pain receptors. You have these alpha delta fibers or A delta fibers and these C fibers. This is that fast, prickly, sharp pain. You know exactly where you got cut versus the dull, aching, poorly localized. You're like, it's burning. You know, doctors or practitioners are always like, is it sharp pain or is it dull pain? They're trying to kind of figure out the pathways that are coming through. There are also chemicals that are going to activate the nociceptors for pain and pain perception. We can also have referred pain, meaning we're perceiving the pain from coming from a completely different source than where it's actually coming from. So this is kind of showing you the heart, right? So left arm, heartburn, that's esophagus, or stomach upset. These are really, really common with heart attacks because those first order neurons from all these are synapsing on the same second order neuron coming from the heart. So your heart can be having pain, but since the first order neuron from your heart doesn't usually activate the second order neuron in that pathway, you're going to perceive it from the most common first order neuron. So we mostly perceive pain coming from skin or arm. And so they are synapsing here on the same second order neuron. This is first order. This is first order. Remember, pain is perception. And so since they are synapsing on the same second order neuron, it goes to the thalamus, it goes to the somatosensory cortex, and we're going to perceive it from the most common place, which is going to be our arm or our skin. It takes a while to realize, oh no, it's actually coming from our heart. And so that's why heart attacks, where your heart muscle cells are no longer getting oxygen and they start to die, they're releasing these chemicals out of the heart muscle cells or the cardiomyocytes, and it's activating the pain receptors, that first order neuron, but your brain is not understanding that that's the first order neuron it's coming from. It's just assuming it's coming from the most common first order neuron that's activated, and that would be your skin. So that's kind of, by the way, referred pain. So kind of good to understand that. We can also modulate pain. This is why you rub an area. Say you have a really bad headache. You're going to push on your temples really hard on the sides of your head, because if you're pushing on a mechanoreceptor really, really hard, this stimulus becomes greater. That's a really bad becomes greater. And it's going to then inhibit the pain coming from the nociceptor. So we're now just feeling the stimulus from the skin, right? If you increase the stimulus from the mechanoreceptor surrounding the noci or pain receptor, you can kind of inhibit the pain. So that's why we rub. All right, I'm going to finish up there. Next lecture, we're going to get into the eye.